Welcome back to my full review of the Legend of Zelda series Part 5. In this one, I'm covering games 41 to 50, going through the end of the 3DS era into modern times with the Switch. This video will get us caught up to every single Zelda game released as of right now, but don't worry, in the next week or so there will be the marathon video, which will include a review of Echoes of Wisdom. I have sank thousands of hours into this project, both playing the games and editing, and I've had a ton of fun doing it. And let's just jump right into the review here, starting with game number 41. Now we're diving into the last fully multiplayer Zelda game on this list as of right now, and it's also the last 3DS title as well, Triforce Heroes. This game is unique in that the multiplayer aspects are built entirely around having 3 different players to solve puzzles, and Triforce Heroes is best played with a couple of friends, although thankfully they did include a single player mode. Triforce Heroes takes place in a land called Hytopia, a strange area far removed from Hyrule that is obsessed with fashion. An evil woman curses the princess so that she can only wear a black leotard. The king then puts out a call for a hero of a certain description to defeat the lady and break the curse on his daughter, and Link is immediately recruited for the task. And that's honestly just about all the plot you really get in Triforce Heroes up until the very end of the game. It's a very gameplay focused title with the story taking a backseat. To save the princess, you'll be fighting your way through 8 different worlds, each of which is split into 4 different sections, each section of which has 4 different levels. If you're keeping track, that's 128 different stages to clear in the base game. The game also features a free DLC expansion called the Den of Trials, which contains 40 levels back to back to complete, although unlike the main levels, the Den of Trials is purely combat challenges. After you beat each section, you'll get a piece of loot, which can later be used along with rupees to craft different outfits, all of which give Link different abilities and buffs. Graphically, Triforce Heroes looks okay, but it's far from my favorite Zelda game aesthetically. From what I understand, it was given very simplistic graphics as they were found easier to read and keep track of on the small screen of the 3DS, but because of that, it definitely leaves the game looking a little bit flat and bland. That being said though, the characters all look fine, especially when there's close-ups. Control-wise, it does feel pretty good to play, with Link's movements and the general gameplay being very fast and fluid. You can use the bottom screen to send emotes and communicate with other players or to spec them directly, but otherwise the game takes place almost entirely on the top screen. And it's important to keep in mind that you can only play this game with 3 people or solo. There's no 2-player option, which feels like an oversight. The puzzles in this game are designed to take advantage of having 3 different people, and honestly, they're some of the most complex yet fun puzzles I've come across in the entire series. Lots of them will require each player to be in exactly the right place with the right item, and coordinating your efforts is key. More than any of the other multiplayer Zelda titles, this one is an extremely cooperative effort. All players share 1 combined health bar, however you do get 3 lives thankfully and individual magic bars. The items you pick up in this game are mainly staples of the Zelda series, although it was definitely fun to see some rarely used items return in this context. Much like the Four Swords games, you can only hold 1 item at a time. Each of us tended to have favorites among the different items, and we got very good at using specific ones. You also have the ability to throw other players around or stack on top of each other as a totem, either 2 or 3 people high, and this was used as a game mechanic very often. Triforce Heroes is at its best with all 3 players running around, causing chaos, cooperating, and solving puzzles and challenges together. There were legitimately some moments where all 3 of us were dying of laughter at something stupid that happened or a crazy death, or when we were cheering each other on when someone made a perfect throw, finally defeated a tough boss, or solved a particularly difficult challenge that we came across. There was also a real sense of accomplishment throughout beating this game because it was surprisingly challenging. And this is where I should mention that the bosses were one of my least favorite parts of the game. Many of them were extremely difficult, using mechanics that took a lot of experimentation to figure out and weren't really taught to you beforehand. I wouldn't say that most of the bosses were necessarily badly designed, I just wish what you had to do to defeat the bosses was better explained to you beforehand. If you decide to play the game single player, you control 1 Link as well as 2 lifeless totems that you can transfer your spirit into. I didn't particularly like the single player mode and felt like it lost a lot of what made the game fun. That being said though, I am glad that it was included, especially now that there's no legitimate online play. I also did find it a drag to have to grind for materials to get outfits, without which we probably could not have made it through a lot of the different levels. There was a very high degree of RNG involved, whether you're beating the levels hoping for a specific drop, buying materials from the shop, or using the minigame. There's also no way to trade different materials between players, which I think would have solved the issue. I did like how useful the outfits were though, and I enjoy the different references that they snuck into other games and characters. So eventually, after you've made your way through most of the levels and reached the final world, you find out that the evil woman who cursed the princess is actually the sister sister of the fashion designer who makes all of your outfits. After a very grueling boss fight, you finally defeat her, and then you craft and put on her outfit, which allows you to break the curse on the princess. After this, there's a celebration and the kingdom returns to normal. As a special bonus, you get the princess's weird leotard as an outfit that you can actually wear. There's a few other game modes that you can try out, like a Colosseum versus battle, and there's obviously a lot of challenges that you can complete on the levels, but otherwise that's pretty much the game. So taking all of that into account, Triforce Heroes actually gets a low B rank. I found it surprisingly fun and really enjoyed the multiplayer aspect. That being said, if I was reviewing it purely as a single player experience, it would have been significantly lower on the list. However, if you're in the mood for some challenging puzzles, even harder bosses, and tons of levels to play through, and you're able to find exactly 2 friends willing to play alongside you, this is a very solid experience through and through. And now we're covering the second Zelda HD re-release on the Wii U, Twilight Princess HD. This re-release is very similar to Wind Waker HD, where the graphics have been given a new coat of polish, some quality of life tweaks have been added, and it also features an updated control scheme. The plot of Twilight Princess HD is the same as the original. You play Link in Ordon Village, which shortly after starting the game is invaded by monsters who kidnap several people, mainly children. While pursuing them, Link is pulled into the Twilight Realm and then transformed into a wolf. He meets Midna, who is your companion for the rest of the game, and then you go to meet Zelda, who tells you that she surrendered Hyrule to the usurper Zant to prevent him from killing everyone. After cleansing a sacred spring and being turned back into a human, you go on a quest with Midna to collect something called the Fused Shadows, which contain the ancient magic of her people, with the intent of using them to defeat Zant. You also search for the missing villagers, and eventually you do save them. When you obtain all of the Fused Shadows, Zant appears and takes them back, and then he sends Midna to the realm of the light, mortally wounding her. Zelda manages to save Midna by sacrificing herself, and the two of you go on a quest to get the Master Sword, after which you then restore the broken pieces of the Twilight Mirror, which is the link between the two worlds. After defeating Zant and reclaiming the Fused Shadows, the true villain behind his power is revealed to be Ganon, who had been banished to the Twilight Realm by the sages after they could not kill him. Midna and Link team up to stop him, first fighting a possessed Zelda, and then Ganon in beast form. Together, Zelda and Link then team up to take out Ganon once and for all, culminating in a one-on-one sword battle. After Ganon is finally killed, Midna is returned to her true form as the Twilight Princess, and as she returns to the Twilight Realm, she shatters the mirror so that the two worlds can never interfere with each other ever again. After this, Link rides off into the distance to seek new adventures. Aesthetically, Twilight Princess HD looks very faithful to the original. The main difference is that the graphics have been cleaned up and are a lot more clear and readable. The fact that it looks like a pretty standard game from the GameCube era actually gives Twilight Princess its own personality when compared to the other 3D Zelda titles, all of which are heavily stylized from this point onwards. I still find myself very much liking all of the character designs, and also the designs for the monsters who all look just a bit twisted. Twilight Princess HD also keeps its GameCube orientation, although if you play on the much harder hero mode, it will once again be mirror flipped like the Wii version. When using the gamepad, you can at all times view either the map or your inventory, and it also lets you have gyroscopic aiming, which still works pretty well, although I did find it a bit more fidgety in this game than it was in Wind Waker HD. All of the items that you get in this game were still very fun to use, and I really like that this game has you combine items together. For example, adding a scope to your bow or creating bomb arrows. The beginning of Twilight Princess definitely still does drag on a bit and is kind of slow, but I did appreciate that they have made some minor tweaks to help speed things along, like reducing the number of tears of light that you need to collect to restore the springs. All of the dungeons return from the original and seem relatively unchanged, with the main gameplay loop of Twilight Princess being going from dungeon to dungeon and collecting key items at the end. I still think that this game features some of the most interesting and inventive dungeons in the entire series, letting you use both classic and new items in very unique ways to solve the different puzzles. I will say though that not every dungeon was a masterpiece. The water dungeon in particular I found overly long with a lot of backtracking, and I really didn't care for the final boss of it either. That being said, with the exception of that one boss and also the one from the Sky Temple, all of the other bosses in the game were very fun and some were legitimate challenges. The final boss fight against Ganon is very intense, having 4 different stages, and it was a lot of fun. In terms of collectibles, there's still pose and bugs to get for Agatha, sword techniques to learn, and a new one in the form of Miiverse stamps, with the pose still being the worst of the bunch because you have to wait until it's nighttime to fight the majority of them, and Twilight Princess still has no way of skipping ahead time. Twilight Princess HD also supports amiibos, and their functionality can be accessed from the collection screen. You can activate a special dungeon exclusive to Twilight Princess HD HD by using the Wolf Link amiibo. This is called the Cave of Shadows. This special dungeon is very similar to the Cave of Ordeals, except that the entirety of this one has to be completed as Wolf Link. Also, fun fact, whatever amount of hearts you have at the end can then be saved to the amiibo, and if you summon Wolf Link in Breath of the Wild, he'll have that much total health. Twilight Princess HD actually reminds me a lot of Ocarina of Time on the 3DS, because there are pretty minimal changes overall and a small amount of new content which is completely optional. I do have a few minor complaints like the day and night cycle, overabundance of collectibles, and I still feel like the game is a bit too long for its own good, but these are pretty minor complaints in the grand scheme of things. And with that in mind, it also gets an S rank just slightly above the GameCube version. Coming back to this one, I still think that the story and characters are very solid. It has some of my favorite dungeons, items, and mechanics in the entire series thus far. While I don't think this version of the game is leaps and bounds better than the original, it does offer some new content, as well as a much clearer visual style which helps it come out ahead. Regardless of which version you play though, you're sure to have a good time. Twilight Princess is definitely a classic. And now we're diving into yet another Legend of Zelda spin-off, this time on the 3DS. My Nintendo Picross, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. This is yet another one of those games that I'm covering that's a bit hard to play nowadays, as it was a downloadable only title for the 3DS and you had to use My Nintendo points. Now for some context, if you aren't familiar with the different games, Picross is a series of logic puzzles where you need to fill in blanks on a grid. The blanks that need to be filled in are determined by numbers along the sides of the rows and columns. For example, if a row has the number 9, it means you need 9 blocks or pixels filled in that row. And what makes Picross a little bit different is that filling in the different boxes will actually give you a picture at the end. It reminds me a little bit of Sudoku, but it definitely has its own internal logic and vibe to it. Now, I'm not personally into logic puzzles all that much, but I do know that some people really enjoy them. So the game starts off with a pretty in-depth tutorial of how a Picross game works, with Midna guiding you, and then it throws you into some actual levels pretty quickly. I also really appreciate that it has a few options to make the games a little bit easier in case you're not a huge Picross fan, or in case you find it too challenging. One of these options is Roulette, which will fill in a random row and column for you, and the other is Auto Checker, which will notify you when you mark a square wrong, but at the cost of a time penalty. If your time goes over 60 minutes per puzzle, you'll only get a black and white photo and it isn't considered truly completed. Finishing it in under 60 minutes gives you the full color photo. This probably sounds easy to do, but again, remember, if you have Auto Checker on, every time you mark a box incorrectly, you do get time added to your timer as a penalty. One of the good things to keep in mind though is that if you do fail to complete a puzzle in the allotted time, if you're able to remember where most of the squares are, you can usually ace it on your second try, since nothing changes and the pictures themselves are predetermined. So the pictures that you're filling in during this game of Picross are of items, characters, and locales from the Legend of Zelda series. As you progress, the grids you are filling in do get bigger and the pictures you are making do get more detailed, but this also scales up the difficulty. The vast majority of the pictures that I was creating here, I was not able to figure out what they were supposed to be until the final pixel was filled in and the game revealed it to me. So there's 3 different game modes available, and when you beat one of them, you get a gold medal next to it on the main menu. The first mode, which is just called Picross, is pretty basic and has all the features I mentioned. Most of the puzzles in this regular mode are pretty easy, but the second mode, called Mega Picross, adds a new rule where multiple rows need to have combined pixels that add up to a certain number, which makes things a bit more complicated. Other than that though, this second mode is more or less the exact same game. The final mode is called Micross, and for this one you're solving one big picture by filling in multiple smaller ones. In this final mode, the accessibility options from the other modes are removed, and you have to solve it without any help or assistance from the game whatsoever. Because of that, it's significantly harder than the previous modes, but after you've filled in a few of the different pictures here, you are able to see what the larger picture is that you're filling in, and you can kind of use that as a guide to help you with the smaller picture that you're working on. There's also no timer to worry about in this mode, at least, so you can take as long as you need. So there definitely isn't a ton of depth to this game, but if you're like me and you aren't amazing at logic puzzles, it'll probably take you a while to complete. This is also definitely a game that's not intended for you to beat it in one sitting. It's designed for you to do a couple of puzzles here and there when you have some downtime, and that's how I approached it as well. So while it does have characters and music from Twilight Princess, it's definitely not a puzzle game that's built all around Zelda. And because of that, it's a bit underwhelming and definitely doesn't stand out in the plethora of Zelda games that we can play. Ranking it as a Zelda game, I would give it a C rank. Now that being said, if you do enjoy both logic puzzles and the Legend of Zelda series, this might be a really fun experience for you. And there's definitely enough content here to sink your teeth into. But again, if you're specifically looking to play a Legend of Zelda game, there's a lot of other options out there that will properly scratch that itch. And now finally, it's time to cover Breath of the Wild, the first truly open-world Zelda game that Nintendo released. And while this game has been overshadowed a lot by Tears of the Kingdom recently, it's still a pretty good game in its own right. This one starts off with Link waking up to the sound of Zelda's voice, and he then runs outside and you as the player get to behold the entire world that you're going to be able to explore. This is honestly a pretty cool way to start off the game. You soon learn that 100 years ago there was a great war where the people fought against Ganon and his army of machines called Guardians. During this war, Link was gravely injured protecting Zelda, and he's been in a sleep for 100 years recovering. And this has led to him losing a lot of his past memories. Zelda is currently trapped in the castle with Ganon and is using her power to restrain him, but slowly her strength is failing. As the game progresses, you're able to learn more about what happened in this great war, as well as the fates of Zelda's other 4 protectors known as the Champions, or not if you don't want to. The vast majority of the story in this game is entirely optional. After a pretty brief tutorial area which teaches you the mechanics of the game and gives you a bunch of abilities, you can pretty much go anywhere you want. If you want to go and try and fight the final boss of the game, you can do that right away. There are several key abilities that you get in this game that make it feel very different from any other Zelda before it. The first one is pretty standard. It lets you summon an unlimited amount of bombs, but the second actually lets you form a pillar of ice in the water. The third allows you to move metallic objects. The fourth ability lets you freeze objects in time, and hitting them when they're frozen will actually cause them to shoot forwards. You use these abilities in various different ways when solving puzzles throughout the game, and it definitely gives it a unique feel. You can also use amiibos with Breath of the Wild, which will usually just drop a bunch of items on the ground for you, but a few special ones will also give you outfits or even summon a helpful friend. One of the things that this game gets extremely right is actually Link's movement. He feels really good to move around, and the climbing mechanic is amazing. A lot of open world games claim that anywhere you see you can go, but this is one of the few games that actually makes good on that claim. Anywhere you see, any mountain, anything, you can climb that, you can go there. The main quest basically has you go and free the Divine Beasts, which are the closest thing you get to a standard Zelda dungeon in this game. And after you free each of them from Ganon's influence, you get a special ability, such as this glowing shield, this lightning attack, or the ability to soar high up in the sky, which is hands down the most useful one you'll get in the entire game. And then there are also scattered memories throughout the land, where when you get them, you get a nice little cutscene that plays. And honestly, for the most part, that's about all the plot you really get in this game. For the amount of time you have to invest in it, the plot is spread pretty thin. Now, that being said, this isn't unique to just Breath of the Wild. All open world games have this issue, but compared to most other Zelda games, it did stand out a little bit. There are a ton of side quests that you can do. Some of them will actually unearth shrines, which are little mini dungeons that have puzzles or combat challenges for you to do. Beating these shrines will give you spirit orbs, which you can then use to upgrade your maximum hearts or your stamina. And I will say that stamina feels a lot better implemented in this game than it does in Skyward Sword. As well as side quests for shrines, there's also normal side quests, and some of these can be amazing and some of these can be really, really boring. I would say about 75% of them are pretty much just fetch quests, and they're not super fun to do. And there's also a bunch of different armor sets that you can wear that will give you different upgrades. All in all, I probably use only about 4 or 5 of these armor sets regularly, so it's not worth getting all of them and upgrading them 100%. You also have a wide range of weapons that you can use. You're no longer just limited to a sword. You can use clubs, you can use spears, there's a bunch of stuff. One of the drawbacks to this, though, is that all of these weapons have a durability and a breaking point, and they will all eventually shatter. And I've seen this be a huge point of contention online for the weapon durability. Overall, I think it's a good concept, but especially at the very beginning of the game, when you can only hold a few weapons at a time, I found it really annoying. There were a lot of fights that I would get into where basically it just came down to, do I have enough weapons physically on me to do this? Now, later on in the game, when you can hold a bunch more weapons and whatnot, this becomes a minor issue, and it lets you approach fights more of like a puzzle of what's the best way to do this. But at the very beginning, where you don't have a lot of options, I do agree that I find this kind of annoying, and I feel like it could be balanced better. Another issue I have with this game is the weather system. There is rain and there is thunder, and both of these are annoying in different ways, especially the rain though. So much of this game is about exploring different areas, and you are not able to properly climb walls while it's raining, and this just becomes extremely frustrating. There were so many points where I had to do a thing, it's what I wanted to do, and I basically had to just not do it and do something else instead because it was raining. And I get that they were going for a sense of realism, but I found this mechanic dragged down a lot of the experience. Another aspect of this game is the Korok seeds. There are these little Koroks hidden throughout the land, and there's a very basic puzzle that you have to solve to unearth them. Every time you find one, you get a Korok seed. You trade it into this guy Hestu, and he will let you upgrade how many weapons, bows, or shields you can carry. However, it takes less than half of the total amount of seeds in-game to fully upgrade all of your stashes. Also, unlike every other mainline Zelda before it, this game also has some DLC. The first DLC revolves around the Master Sword and has you going through combat challenges where you're not able to die. This was kind of fun, but I definitely got tired of it long before it ended. And the second DLC dives a little bit more into the backstory of the different champions, and it's absolutely worth doing because you get upgrades that decrease the amount of time it takes for the champion abilities to recharge, as well as you get a motorbike, which feels really weird, but it can be useful. It basically is just there to replace horses, which is something I already didn't really use, but you know, if you obtain all of the memories in the game, you get a special cutscene at the end. I think this is probably worth doing because there's already not a whole lot of plot, so getting those memories is crucial to understanding the story. All in all, I think this is a pretty fun game, and it's one of the better Zeldas out there, although it definitely has some issues that drag down the overall experience for me. And even if you're playing Tears of the Kingdom, I still think it's worth returning to this one, even if nothing else, just so you can actually hang out with Best Boy here. With all of that in mind, I give this game an A rank. I think it's very solid. It's definitely worth playing. Personally though, having done it twice, I would recommend not 100% completing it. I don't think that's worth it, but playing through to the end and doing all the stuff that interests you, definitely recommend this one. And now, for the third time, we're covering Link's Awakening, but this time the most recent version for the Nintendo Switch. Having greatly enjoyed the first two versions I played, I'm very much looking forward to this one. The game starts off with a now fully animated cutscene, and this cutscene goes hard. It was really fun to watch. Link is caught up in a storm before he's washed up on the shore of Koholint Island, and he's then discovered by the character Marin and brought to her home. After Link wakes up and gets back his sword and shield, he discovers that the only way he'll be able to leave the island is to wake the windfish, which is an almost godlike creature that slumbers in a giant egg at the top of the mountain. In order to do this, he needs to collect various instruments that are located in different dungeons throughout the land. During this quest, Link eventually learns that the entire island and all of its inhabitants are actually a dream conjured up by the windfish, and if you wake it up, everything will disappear. Despite the repercussions to all of the denizens of the island, Link eventually does wake the windfish up, and he's then cast back into the sea, finally able to continue his journey. Link's Awakening is a very unique game in the Zelda franchise, in that it doesn't actually feature Princess Zelda, the Triforce, or even Ganon in any meaningful way. The original game drew a lot on what made the previous Zelda game successful, and this modern remake tries to preserve all of that while also updating some of the more outdated aspects. Graphically, the Switch version looks very unique. Everything has a shiny, almost toy look to it. The overworld looks lush, and you no longer have to worry about scrolling screens here anymore. Any scenery that is out of your immediate view has a blurred effect, which does take a bit of getting used to. The one place where scrolling screens does return is actually in the dungeons, which is probably a good call. A lot of these puzzles would have needed to be massively changed without that mechanic. The aesthetic for this version of Link's Awakening really grew on me over time and helped make this game feel almost as charming as the original. So the majority of this game is you going from dungeon to dungeon, solving puzzles, defeating bosses, and collecting musical instruments. The dungeons are all pretty straightforward, and while a few might trip you up a bit, they all feel meticulously designed. I did find a lot of the bosses easier this time around, although plenty of them were still a challenge. Other than dungeons and exploring the overworld, there's still the typical very long, drawn-out trading sequence that you see in a lot of Zelda games, as well as a variety of mini-games and the like for you to mess around with while exploring. There aren't really any side quests you need to worry about, so for the most part this game does feel pretty linear, but not in a bad way. One of the first changes that I noticed in this version of Link's Awakening is that your sword and shield are now permanently mapped to specific buttons. Later on, when you get the Pegasus boots, they're also mapped to their own button, just like in A Link to the Past, and so is the power bracelet. The controller that you use to play this game has a lot more buttons overall than the Game Boy did, and as a result, there's a lot less time spent in your inventory swapping items compared to the previous two versions of this game. I also really like that they made the power-up music a lot less obnoxious, to the point where I no longer actively avoided picking them up. They also overhauled the warp mechanic, and it was a very welcome change. They also added 2 new collectibles in this version, statues and chamber stones, as well as increasing the number of secret seashells and heart containers. A bunch of collectibles have to be won from the so-called trendy game, which in this version of Link's Awakening has realistic claw game physics for some reason. It's a minor detail that I'm surprised they put so much thought into. In fact, overall, the attention to detail in this version of Link's Awakening is great. Another really good example of this is how these knight statues move in an L shape when you throw them. It's something that I never noticed before, and I really appreciated that little touch. An entirely new idea that they added to this version of the game is dungeon building. You can find the character Dompe in his shack, which is located where the photographer used to be, and he will have you complete small challenges for him that involve building and rearranging rooms in dungeons in certain ways and then clearing them, sometimes with an added difficulty like not being able to use your sword while you do it. You get rewarded for doing this with more chamber pieces that you can use to create your dungeons, and bonus rupees you find within the dungeons themselves. There's also a mechanic where you can save the dungeons you have built using an amiibo and share them with friends, but I didn't mess around with this much since it seemed like more of a hassle than it was worth. While this can be a fun little distraction from the main adventure, I found it very limited, as you can only use rooms you've previously come across or unlocked in the game. You aren't able to actually design your own rooms or puzzles, which is really disappointing, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't really feel like the dungeon building added much to the game, and it mostly just padded out the runtime. Because the photographer is gone, those fun photo opportunities with the different characters across the land are also absent from this version of Link's Awakening, and this ended up making a lot of the characters feel less fleshed out than they did in the Game Boy Color version. Thankfully, most of the photo interactions with Marin are now turned into fun little cutscenes. I still wish that they had implemented all of those character moments into small little cutscenes and not just a select few. The extra dungeon from the Game Boy Color version does reappear in this version at least, with the same puzzles, bosses, and reward at the end. I also still really like how characters have their own side adventures while Link is running around, like Terran and Marin who pop up in different locales throughout the game. So even though I do feel like most of the new content that they brought to the table here doesn't add much to the overall experience, and despite all of the small character moments that we lost because they removed the photographer, I do feel like this is the best iteration of Link's Awakening to date. And for that reason, Link's Awakening on the Nintendo Switch manages to get an S rank from me. This game was consistently fun throughout, to the point where it's another one that I actually 100% completed. While I do think the Game Boy Color version is still worth playing and hasn't been fully replaced, playing it on the Switch is still very fun, different enough that you won't get bored, and definitely worth your time. Next up, we have a pretty unusual Zelda game, Cadence of Hyrule. This is a Zelda-themed spin-off slash reimagining of another very popular game, Crypt of the Necrodancer, where the basic idea is to move to the beat of the music to defeat enemies. While mechanically the game is very similar to the original, the Nintendo version has an overworld, dialogue, and a main quest to follow. You start off playing the character Cadence, who gets transported into the land of Hyrule. The fairy Trill then guides you through a pretty brief tutorial, and at the end of this, you get the choice of waking up either Zelda or Link, and whichever one you choose becomes your main playable character. You then find out that a musician named Octavo put Link, Zelda, and the King under a sleeping spell, and so you go on a quest to defeat him, starting with his 4 champions. Defeating each of these champions actually rewards you with a musical instrument, which harkens back to Link's Awakening. In fact, this game has a ton of callbacks and Easter eggs seeded throughout that reference previous Zelda titles. Graphically, this game looks gorgeous. When you think back to really good pixel art Zelda games, chances are A Link to the Past comes to mind, or maybe something like the Minish Cap. But in my opinion, this game blows them all out of the water. The music in this game also totally slaps. They really went above and beyond with the various Zelda tracks that are featured. They have all undergone an electronic style remix, and it works extremely well in tandem with the gameplay. Lo-fi Zelda beats to study to, anyone? The basic gameplay has you moving around on a grid-based system with enemies around you also bound to these confines. If you move next to an enemy and try to move to them, you will attack, but they can also move to you and attack you instead. It actually kind of reminds me of the Nelsonic Zelda Gme Watch, strangely enough. You can also push certain blocks and dig through dirt if you have a shovel. In the standard mode, moving to the beat will increase your multiplier, but missing a beat will reset it to 0. There's also pads all over the world that will increase or decrease the tempo, and it really keeps you on your toes, as well as pads that will push you or enemies in a specific direction when you step on them. There's also a second playstyle called Fixed Beat, where you do not have to worry about increasing tempos or moving to the beat at all, and the monsters will actually only move when you do. I think that both modes have merits, and I flip between them repeatedly throughout my playthrough, but in the end I think I do like the Fixed Beat mode more, just because I like having that opportunity to plan and strategize during each battle. Throughout the journey, you get various items from
both franchises, like the shovel from Crypt of the Necrodancer or bombs from Zelda. I really enjoyed seeing the return of some long-forgotten items like the flippers, which date all the way back to A Link to the Past. You can also get a variety of weapons that will have different effects when you use them. My favorite was the two-handed sword because it has a very long reach, meaning I didn't have to get as close to enemies anymore. There's a bunch of basic puzzles throughout that are very reminiscent of a Zelda game, like sliding around on the ice or pushing these blocks into place. Cadence of Hyrule is also similar in some ways to a roguelike and features a randomly generated world. Dying is something that you'll have to accept is going to happen over and over, especially at the start of the game when you're learning the controls. However, like many good games of this genre, when you die, you get the ability to buy upgrades and items that carry over into your next attempt, which will slowly build up your abilities and health, making the game easier the more you play. There's also some key items that will stay with you even after death. Cadence of Hyrule features a variety of different modes besides the story mode, which helps with the replayability, including a multiplayer mode which was fun to mess around with a bit, but I did mainly play this solo. After beating the game, you unlock a special side story called Octavo's Ode. This actually dives into the main villain's motivations and reasoning for doing what he did during the main campaign. Since you're locked into this one character and his attack style, I didn't really enjoy this as much as the main campaign. There was a lot less room for experimenting and finding what worked for me, and I just kind of had to get good at a playstyle I didn't really like. When you defeat the 4 champions and make it through the Hyrule Castle dungeon, Octavo reveals that he was training these 4 champions in the hope that they could defeat Ganon. After you defeat Octavo, you get transported into the future where he attempts to fight Ganon himself and fails. You then control Link, Zelda, and Cadence in this fight and get the job done yourself, and then using the power of the Triforce, Cadence gets teleported back to her world. There were also a few different DLC packs released for this game which add new characters and music options, but the biggest one is called Symphony of the Mask and involves the Deku Scrub village and a playable Deku Scrub character. You go around gathering masks, such as the Goron or Zora one, and they all give him different abilities, reminding me of Majora's Mask. And it was actually during this part of my playthrough that the game actually broke down a bit for me. It became a chore to clear through each screen, and there were a lot of obtuse puzzles that lacked the care that would go into a normal Zelda game. I particularly disliked the Temple of Brainstorming, because the entire game slowed to a crawl as I pushed around boulders in a poor man's version of Goof Troop. Originally, this game would have actually been a B rank for me, as there was a point where the combat grew on me and started to get really fun, but playing through the DLC actually dropped it back down to a high C rank. This one was a bit of a roller coaster, as I didn't much care for it at the start, ended up really liking it in the middle, and then by the end once again found myself not having a great time with it. There definitely is fun to be had here, and I like that it allows you to try out different play styles to figure out what works best for you, but at the end of the day, it's quite short, very repetitive, drags on in a lot of places, and it just ended up being something that I'm not really looking for in a Legend of Zelda title. Now we're covering the second entry in the Hyrule Warriors series. This one's called Age of Calamity. In terms of gameplay and style, it's extremely similar to the previous entry, mixing elements from the Legend of Zelda series with the gameplay of Dynasty Warriors. However, this game takes place shortly before Breath of the Wild, focusing on the time 100 years ago before Calamity Ganon. The opening cutscene shows Hyrule Castle being stormed by guardians and Zelda using her power to protect Link. However, doing so inadvertently wakes up a tiny egg-shaped guardian in the castle. This BB-8 looking machine watches Zelda as she opposes Ganon and is then launched through a portal, traveling through time and appearing a few weeks earlier, slightly changing the events of the timeline. The game then immediately throws you into a fight as Link, and after defeating a few waves of enemies, Link steps in to save Impa and gets a hold of her Sheikah Slate, which activates the little guardian and also causes the Sheikah Tower to come bursting out of the ground. Because of his deeds in battle, Link is appointed to be a knight and protect Zelda. The next leg of the journey is meeting with the various champions to get them to join in the fight against Calamity Ganon. Visually, this game is pretty much identical to Breath of the Wild and the later Tears of the Kingdom by extension. It's a visual style I'm very used to by now, so it didn't really wow me, but I do think keeping the aesthetic consistent makes sense for a prequel. All of the characters look pretty much how you'd expect, and every playable character is also fully voiced, which definitely comes across as a bit odd for some of them. The stages that you play through are mainly locales you would have visited in Breath of the Wild, and you're definitely going to
to recognize the majority of them, although for the most part they have been expanded to be able to more easily fit the Warriors type of gameplay. You control a very large cast of characters and mow down entire armies using various combos, weapons, and special abilities. You do still capture enemy keeps for your side and have to protect them and other characters, but I will say this aspect has been downplayed quite a bit compared to the original game, which I do think improves the overall experience. Each of the different playable characters has their own movement and fighting style, and they all feel very different to play as, which allows you to very quickly find favorites as well as characters you try and avoid at all costs. It really lets you experiment and figure out a playstyle that works for you. And characters will unlock as you play through the story, giving you more options to pick from. In addition to the regular combos and special moves from the previous game, each character can now access Link's Sheikah Slate abilities such as bombs and magnesis, as well as use elemental rod attacks. The fighting in this game also has a much higher focus on dodging and exploiting the weak points of enemies, making it feel like there's a lot more strategy involved this time around and a lot less button mashing. Age of Calamity is broken up into a series of story missions that you can select, and in between these you're taken to the overworld map, which has various icons on it, and these icons indicate main quests, side quests, and also small little interactions where an NPC will require various items or ingredients, and if you can get these for them, it gives you a small reward like a new special move or more hearts. As you progress through the story, new side quests and challenges will appear on the map, and these remind me a lot of the adventure mode from Hyrule Warriors Legends. The challenges typically involve playing as a specific character or defeating certain enemies within a time frame, and some of them were legitimately difficult. They were usually fun, but there were definitely still way too many, especially if you count everything that's added from the DLC for this game. The first DLC update focuses on the Ancient Tech Lab, which basically creates a skill tree made up of various challenges and mini missions, and you get helpful rewards as you complete these. And there are also special extra difficult fights that appear throughout the map to test your abilities. The second update added a bunch of new stages and story elements that start popping up around the middle of the game. Age of Calamity swung hard in the opposite direction of Breath of the Wild when it comes to the story, with a huge amount of cutscenes present throughout this game. And I'll also say that without the DLC to fill in the gaps in the middle of the story, there are a ton of plot points that are never really expanded upon or revealed, which means you do need the DLC to actually understand the full scope of what's going on and all of the character motivations. So the plot follows the events that we know happened before the Calamity pretty closely, although the addition of the new baby guardian does change things slightly here and there. It's revealed that Calamity Ganon actually followed the little guardian through the time rift and then possessed its non-activated body from this present time period. And Calamity Ganon then uses its knowledge to assist the Yuga clan and bring about the Calamity ahead of schedule, using a seer as his spokesperson. When the Calamity happens, the king then sacrifices himself to save Zelda, which buys them enough time to actually go to the different divine beasts and save the champions this time around. And this is where the story takes a hard left turn from what we know, with new characters from Breath of the Wild jumping back into the past to help. The seer eventually turns on the Yuga clan, who are the main enemies that you'd been fighting up to this point, and then Master Koga actually defects to Zelda's side. It's also revealed that the king survived his ordeal as well, and both of them join your party as playable characters. You eventually defeat the seer one final time, and he is then absorbed by Ganon. The baby guardian robot sacrifices itself, after which the entire team finally takes down Calamity Ganon once and for all. And right before the credits roll, all of Hyrule celebrates the new era of peace, and all of the characters from the future timeline return back to where they belong. Beating the main story will open up a massive amount of extra missions and side quests, one of which is the ability to repair your little guardian friend, which unlocks it as yet another playable character. Completing pretty much every side mission and also unlocking all of the different characters unlocks yet another final mission, and at the end of this you actually unlock Calamity Ganon as a playable character. So Age of Calamity was definitely an improvement in most regards compared to the first Hyrule Warriors. This game is still far from perfect, mind you, but it was surprisingly fun. The story also wasn't anything groundbreaking, following events where you pretty much already know the outcome, and then with a very predictable ending. Because of this and the release of Tears of the Kingdom, it also makes the game yet again non-canon. So with all of that in mind, Age of Calamity gets a respectable B rank from me. I definitely enjoyed playing through this one a lot more than the original Hyrule Warriors game. It's not a radically different experience, but thanks to all the extra polish in regards to the gameplay and combat, I do feel that it plays a lot better. Age of Calamity is definitely not for everyone, not even for all fans of Zelda, but if the Hyrule Warriors formula does look interesting to you, I would probably recommend this game as a pretty good starting point. Now we're covering the most recent Zelda HD remaster. This time it's Skyward Sword HD for the Nintendo Switch. This version of the game doesn't add a ton of new features or tweaks, but it does add an entirely button-based control scheme, allowing the game to play a lot more like a traditional Zelda. The plot for this title is as follows. Link gets rudely woken up from a nightmare by Zelda's Loftwing, which is a giant bird that the denizens of Skyloft use to fly around from place to place, up in their home above the clouds. After discovering that his own Loftwing has been imprisoned by his rival Groose, Link then frees his bird and goes on to win a competition held by the academy that he goes to. While flying around afterwards to celebrate, Zelda is sucked into a giant tornado, being driven down to the surface world below. The spirit Fi then calls out to Link, getting him to take up the quest to go on and save Zelda, after which Link sets out to the surface world equipped with the sword and a new outfit. An old woman in the ruins of a temple in the sealed grounds sets Link off on his journey, and he then travels through 3 different temples where he meets the demon lord Girahim, a character who was also searching for Zelda but for nefarious reasons. Link finally catches up with Zelda and her protector Impa at the 3rd temple, and he jumps in to protect them from Girahim so that the two of them can escape through a portal in time, which is then destroyed shortly afterwards. Link then goes on a lengthy quest to activate the true power of the Goddess Sword, which allows him to open a twin time gate and finally catch up with Zelda, who then reveals that she is actually the Goddess Hylia reborn in human form, and that eons ago, after sealing a demon king named Demise, she set forth a plan to prevent his resurrection. Zelda then blesses Link's sword and goes into a 1,000-year sleep to preserve the seal on Demise, imploring Link to use the Triforce to banish him once and for all. Link then goes on yet another lengthy journey to uncover the Triforce, and he uses it to banish Demise and then wakes up Zelda, but Girahim takes action traveling into the past in hopes of reviving Demise there instead. A very fierce battle ensues, but it buys enough time for Demise to get resurrected by absorbing Zelda's soul. Link then manages to defeat Demise, who curses Link and Zelda upon his defeat before being sealed within the Master Sword. The group of them then returns to the present and celebrates on the surface world, and Zelda decides to stay below the clouds from this point onwards and asks what Link would like to do next. In terms of the aesthetic, this game still looks pretty great. It's more or less just a very clean upscale of the Wii version rendered in 1080p. That being said, there were so many small touches graphically that I had totally missed in the original version, and they now really pop and stand out. The biggest thing that I noticed right out of the gate is that the game also now runs at a rock solid 60 frames per second, and you will immediately feel the difference if you played through the Wii version. You still have the option of using motion controls, but what really got me excited was the addition of the button control scheme. Controlling the sword has now been mapped to the second thumbstick, with you flicking it in the direction that you want your sword strikes to go, or pressing it in to stab forward. If you hold down the left bumper, you can also use this thumbstick to rotate the camera, and though it is very slow, it is a welcome addition. Other small controls that were previously motion-based have also been remapped in different ways. Gyroscopic aiming was also added for a variety of your weapons like the bow. Everything does feel a lot more precise. A change that I really appreciated is that Fi has been massively toned down, and she no longer pops out constantly from the sword to give you hints or remind you of the basic controls, and instead only appears when called upon or when something of importance is actually happening. They also allow you to more quickly skip through dialogue boxes and also skip cutscenes if you want to. The dungeons themselves are still pretty solid in my opinion, with none of them ever being overly long or tedious. Some of the puzzles were very inventive, requiring using a combination of items in new ways that hadn't been explored before. The bosses of the dungeons tended to be the parts that I found the most frustrating. While the majority of them were totally fine and legitimately fun, there are several like Girahim or the Imprisoned that are just straight up annoying. And the game also reuses a bunch of the bosses throughout the story, which does make it feel like it lacks a bit of variety. The world that you get to explore is broken up into the land above the clouds and also the surface, and you hop between these two pretty regularly. While the starting island of Skyloft can initially feel pretty small, the more you progress through the game, the more it opens up with additional side quests, characters to interact with, and things to do. And exploring the other islands in the sky was also pretty interesting. The surface world is broken up into 3 main areas, which can be categorized as a forest, volcano, and desert. And though I do wish there had been more variety in terms of different environments, you do at least usually open up new paths and sections in these areas when you return to them. One of the new mechanics added to this version of the game is that the Zelda and Loftwing amiibo can be scanned, which immediately lets you return to the sky from any place in the surface world, and then scanning it when you're in the sky will return you to exactly the same place, even in dungeons. This was debatably pretty useful, and I did appreciate that it shaved off some time from some of the longer side quests that involve a lot of back and forth, but because bird statues are plentiful in the surface world, it wasn't anything hugely game-breaking. Speaking of side quests, one of the things I really enjoy about Skyward Sword is the various different characters and the missions they give you. Skyward Sword also isn't afraid to get a little bit weird, with Link having an optional romantic side plot with the item check girl, or also an optional side quest that you can do for Toilet Hand from Majora's Mask fame, and this one has 2 possible endings. So taking all of that into consideration, did this remaster turn Skyward Sword into a perfect game? I'd still have to go with no, although it did improve it in a lot of ways. I still found traveling, especially flying around in the sky, somewhat tedious. The controls were a lot more consistent and precise than in the original, but they could still be awkward and counterintuitive at times. And Skyward Sword also involves a ton of backtracking to areas you've been to previously, which isn't really my favorite thing. I also still think the story runs out of steam about a third of the way through when you finally catch up to Zelda, and after this point it lacks a clear direction, with Link basically just being bounced from one task to another because he was told to do them. The larger ramifications of the plot don't really have any real bearing on the story until the very end. So as a result of all this, Skyward Sword HD now gets a solid A rank from me. I do think that the HD version is a tangible upgrade over the original on the Wii, and I also really appreciate that you can still use the motion controls if you're very attached to that playstyle. I do think that this game has one of the best supporting casts in the entire series, even if it's rather small. I also still think that this is the most believable depiction of the Zelda and Link friendship/relationship to date, and the high concept plot is still one of my favorites in the entire series. If you found the original version frustrating because of its controls, or if you skipped it altogether, this is definitely a preferred version to go with, giving you a lot more options, and I definitely think it's worth playing through if you're a fan of the 3D Zelda titles. Next up is a game that blurs the line a little bit on whether or not it should be actually considered a Zelda game and on this list. In fact, I probably spent more time trying to figure out whether or not I should include it than I did actually playing it. It's pretty inconsequential. Vermin, or Exterminator, is one of the original Game & Watch titles that Nintendo produced. Now, they released this Legend of Zelda reskin as a pack-in game with the new Zelda Game & Watch accessory, and they have been titling it Vermin featuring Link. Now, the reason why ultimately I did include this is because I did include Cadence of Hyrule, which is basically a reskin of Crypt of the Necrodancer, although that one did have a lot more work put in than this did. In this one, instead of the original Game & Watch mascot, it's Link, and instead of defeating Vermin, it's Octoroks maybe? The gameplay here is incredibly simple. You move Link around on a flat plane, and he has to be next to where an Octorok is going to pop up, and then he'll automatically hit it. Basically, you're playing whack-a-mole. There's literally nothing else to it other than that. Sometimes it goes fast, sometimes it goes slow. The gameplay has about as much depth as Pong on the Atari 2600. It's also not helped by the fact that this is an exclusive game to the Zelda Game & Watch, which is just a tiny little thing. It has a tiny screen, and it shouldn't be a big surprise, but there's no music either, just beeps and boops. The only real positive thing that I can say about this game is that I really like the character design for Link. It looks like they took that toy style from the Link's Awakening remake and then just turned it into a sprite. Other than that though, this game is as basic as it gets, and I got bored in less than a minute. Because of all that, I have to give it an F rank. It's definitely not worth buying this entire device just to play it, and it's probably not worth playing overall. It is a cool Easter egg, but as a game, it just doesn't hold up whatsoever. And now we're covering the most recent Legend of Zelda game to date as of the making of this video, the critically acclaimed Tears of the Kingdom for the Switch. This game is a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, so the game starts off with a cutscene where you're exploring below Hyrule Castle, and you briefly control Link following Zelda around as she discovers some long-forgotten history of Hyrule. You eventually come to a central chamber and inadvertently wake up a withered husk of Ganon. Link's arm gets infected with darkness, Zelda disappears, and then the entire castle raises into the sky and Link blacks out. He then wakes up on an island in the sky with a new mechanical arm and meets the spirit of the first king of Hyrule, Rauru. These islands in the sky act as the tutorial for this game, teaching you all of the main mechanics, old and new. A lot of the old staples from Breath of the Wild, like breakable weapons and climbing, are back. You also unlock new abilities that are unique to this game. You can ascend through platforms above you, rewind time on certain objects, fuse items to your weapons or shields, and combine items together into machines and the like. And later on, you even get the ability to build contraptions from pre-existing blueprints or rebuild anything you've built previously. This opening tutorial island will take a pretty long time to clear through in comparison to the previous game, and Tears of the Kingdom does feel like a much slower paced game overall. Eventually though, you do make it back down to the surface where you learn that Princess Zelda is missing, and the main story has you chasing down leads to try and find Zelda's whereabouts. But much like Breath of the Wild, you can pretty much go your own way and do whatever you
you like. You do need to go on a quest to get back your paraglider, but otherwise your options are pretty much limitless. In addition to the main overworld, there's also these Skyloftian islands above, and a completely new area deep underground, adding even more variety. Now, it's still very much the same type of game as its predecessor, but with some new twists and turns added to the formula. You're still collecting Korok seeds, and there's still way too many of them. There's also still shrines that you complete to eventually upgrade your health and stamina, although I will say that the shrines did feel like they had a lot more unique puzzles than the previous game. There's also still the Ubisoft towers that you have to go to in order to fill in chunks of the map, but each one usually has a small puzzle that you have to solve to be able to unlock it. And when you do complete it, you actually get shot up into the sky, and you can repeatedly use the towers to do this, which helps you get to some of the Sky Islands. The Sky Islands themselves are a nice concept, although I did find most of them a bit lacking in terms of stuff to actually do when you're up there, and some of them are really annoying to actually get to. Now, you can also dive down into that lower area I mentioned, but when you do, you need to be very careful of the red glowing goo that's everywhere called Gloom. Gloom will actually drain your hearts and makes you unable to recover your health until you go back into sunlight. Down in the depths, you spend most of the time running around activating light roots to be able to actually light up areas, getting Zonai ore, and finding hidden treasures. You'll also occasionally fight a boss down there like Phantom Ganon or Frox. Cooking returns in this game with some new recipes, and so do the different outfits that Link can wear. Amiibo support is still the same as the previous entry, but unfortunately our favorite doggo doesn't return here. You still collect memories in this game as well, which explains the backstory and lore. These memories are honestly some of the best cutscenes in the entire game and helped elevate the story head and shoulders above what we saw in Breath of the Wild. There's a few new types of side quests in this one, like getting the bubble gems or exploring the well, but generally speaking, most of the quests you do in this game also mirror Breath of the Wild. Now, one of the biggest new additions to this game is your ability to build stuff, which is constantly being used for better or worse. Now, this can be pretty fun since you can essentially use the build function to break the game and do crazy stuff without any consequences. But I did find it mentally draining to have to constantly be building stuff around every corner. There's also a whole boatload of armor sets to upgrade this time around, and they all cost rupees as well as materials to do so. In the end, there were still only about 5 or 6 outfits that I regularly wore. One thing I will say though is that farming the items to upgrade most of these armor sets was a lot easier than it was in Breath of the Wild. Even the rare items like star fragments or parts from the dragons were a lot more accessible. The photographs also make a return here, but thankfully you can still buy them from Robbie instead of having to make sure you get a picture of every single thing in the game. And then there's also paraglider fabrics to collect, many of which are amiibo exclusive. You get points for staying at stables. The list just goes on and on. I found weapon durability to be an even bigger issue in this game, and it became extra apparent in areas like the depths, where the weapons you can pick up are scarce, but the enemies are plentiful. In Breath of the Wild, I felt like I eventually got to a point where I always had a large store of weapons, shields, and bows ready, but in Tears of the Kingdom, I found myself running out very often. Now, that being said, it does feel like they took a lot of the criticisms from Breath of the Wild and tried to address them. Even though there's still only 4, each of the different temples felt a little bit more reminiscent of a traditional Zelda game. I like the fact that the characters who would go on to become sages would actually follow you around and help you in these. There is a much greater focus on the story in Tears of the Kingdom, with the memories of Zelda forming the core of it. And I also really liked how some side quests would reveal new pieces of lore that would flesh out the characters you would see in these cutscenes, helping everything feel a lot more interconnected. You find out by following the main story that Zelda was transported to the past, where she participated in an attempt to stop what may be the very first iteration of Ganon. And while the group of them managed to seal away Ganon's power, he could not be defeated. And so Zelda does everything that she can to try and set things up so that the Link of the future will have a fighting chance against him. And this goes to the extent that she even performs a forbidden ritual and transforms herself into a dragon. This is so that over the course of the millennia, she can recharge the power of the broken Master Sword. You awaken 4 sages in the modern age who are all descendants of the people who fought in that original imprisoning war, and eventually you find a secret 5th sage. And the sages actually follow you around in the overworld, and you can use their abilities at any time, and they'll actually help you out in fights, even though I did find that they get in the way just as much as they help. Eventually you'll dive down into the depths of Hyrule Castle, where the game first started, and fight the Demon King himself. After being defeated, Ganon then undergoes the same draconification process as Zelda so long ago, turning into a terrifying demon demon dragon, and then Zelda as the light dragon rushes to your side to help. This fight was a bit lengthy, but it was a great spectacle and had a really good sense of scale throughout. And I like that it involved the concept of landing on dragons, which was something they had introduced in the main game. So after defeating Dragon Ganon, the Demon King is finally vanquished and Zelda returns to her human form. You actually get to control Link here in a playable section and dive through the sky to save her. This was a really nice moment as it made an entire game of searching for her have a rewarding conclusion. I found the ending overall very powerful and satisfying. I think that adhering to a more classic Zelda structure and plot inside of this open world that they created made for a significantly stronger entry in the series than Breath of the Wild did. While I wouldn't personally want every Zelda entry in the future to be a massive sprawling open world like Tears of the Kingdom was, I do think that this is the best realization of that concept that we've seen to date. With all of that in mind, Tears of the Kingdom gets an S rank. It builds on the already solid foundation of Breath of the Wild, while managing to tie into the established Zelda formula and style a lot more this time around. While I definitely don't think that a lot of the side content is worth doing, and I do not recommend 100% completing it like I did, the main story is super engaging, and plot-wise it's probably my favorite Zelda from the modern era. They did an amazing job with this one, and I definitely recommend it for fans of the series, old and new.
And so that's every single Zelda game covered as of right now. For me, there were definitely a lot of surprises on this list. The Legend of Zelda series has always meant quality, and you can really see that reflected here. While there definitely are some games that aren't the greatest in the series, the overwhelming majority are still worth playing. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who has watched through this entire series. I very much appreciate it. There are more videos coming up on different game series like this one, and I will also be doing a marathon video which will include all 50 games plus one bonus game, Echoes of Wisdom. So that about wraps it up. Again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and hopefully I'll catch you in a future video. Take care, everyone.